Parcero,
Apple Floppy Days,
Commodore,
Candy Floppy Days,
Atari,
TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free.
those floppy days,
The games we play, you shared with me.
those days,
Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days,
SD,
Amiga Floppy Days, Junior, Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free.
those floppy days,
The games we play, you shared with me.
those days,
These floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST.
Commodore 64. What?
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari.
It's at his Radio Shack Color Computer 3.
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
The wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
Hello, and welcome to Floppy Days number 125 for April 2023, and I'm your host, Randy Kindig. We're currently in the year 1982 for home computers. This episode is the continuation of a multi-episode arc that covers the Sinclair ZX Spectrum through all the usual topics. This is the 7th of those, with the first having been an interview with John Grant of Nine Tiles, the second and third being coverage of the history of the Spectrum with Alessandro Grussu, the fourth being the interview with the author of the book The ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer, Mr. Chris Smith, the fifth covering tech specs for the Speccy with Chris, and the sixth covering the topics peripherals, using the machine, and magazines with PJ Evans, tour guide and Sinclair curator at the National Museum of Computing on Bletchley Park in the UK. The topics covered in this episode include books, software, ads, modern upgrades, emulation, buying one today, community, and websites. And once again, my co-host will be the aforementioned PJ Evans, who did a wonderful job last episode. This will be the final episode covering the ZX Spectrum after setting the record in terms of number of episodes on Floppy Days about a single machine. As usual, I will also talk a bit about what I've been up to, including an update on any new acquisitions that have come my way. And I'll tell you briefly about upcoming shows of which I'm aware. Before we get started, I want to mention the show sponsors for Floppy Days that help bring this podcast to you each month. 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts, is a great place to get vintage computer items. This includes video cables, power supplies, PC boards, cartridges, upgrades, and more for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. In the new acquisitions section, I cover each month on this show. Often, one of the items I talk about has been ordered from 8-Bit Classics. Corey has been a friend of the show for some time, and I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Check out the site, he has some great stuff. ArcadeShopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill, is another terrific site to get vintage computer items. Greg has a wide variety of hard-to-find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site that I do and have done a lot of shopping at and have mentioned numerous times on Floppy Days. If anything shows out of stock, just ping Greg through the contact form and he can check whether he has or can get more of the item for you. I also wanted to briefly mention those listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through Patreon.com. This includes Chris Petzel, Tony Capolini, Lawrence, Richard Goldstone, Josh Malone, Andy Collins, Simon McCullough, Jason Moore, and Quentin Barnes. I really appreciate you guys, and it helps offset the cost of running this podcast. Let's get started.
Hi, this is PJ Evans, lifelong ZX Spectrum fan and Sinclair curator at the National Museum of Computing on Bletchley Park, home of the World War II codebreakers. You're listening to the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, now for new acquisitions and what I've been up to. So the first topic is around the Amiga 500 Parcero. That's right, the Amiga 500 Parcero. In recent shows, I've been talking about the wonderful upgrade for the Amiga 1000 created by David Dunkley called the Parcero, and it gives the machine 8 meg of RAM, super quick boot up through auto-loading of Kickstart and Workbench, a virtual hard drive, and more. I highly recommend the upgrade. Now, I also have an Amiga 500, and I've been looking to do similar things with it. I did purchase a 512K card for the front slot to take the Amiga 500 to 1 meg and just successfully installed that. I also, in the past, purchased a Gotek drive and cable for using it as a virtual floppy drive, which I've yet to get working. I think I need to get the firmware updated on the Gotek. Recently, I had purchased an SD-based virtual hard drive for it as well, which again I've not had luck getting to work, although I haven't spent much time with it honestly. After the tremendous success using the Parcero on the Amiga 1000, it really spiked my interest to do something with the Amiga 500. One of the items I found during research was something called the ACA 500 Plus, which lists the following features for your Amiga: 8 meg of RAM, 8 meg of flash, 2 compact flash card slots, which can be used as virtual hard disks, several expansion ports to let you add even more functionality, and an MC68EC000 processor clocked at 14.1 megahertz as standard, and this speed is guaranteed, so essentially it will more than double the speed of your Amiga's processor. Now, while not cheap, it seemed to do a lot of what the Parcero does for the Amiga 1000, but also adds acceleration. I honestly was less interested in the acceleration than I was with the other features. This sounded very intriguing, so I posted on an Amiga forum asking what the best upgrade option was to get upgraded RAM and virtual hard disk for the A500. The answer I got from one person totally surprised me. He indicated that David Dunkley, the designer of the Parcero, was making one for the Amiga 500. In all my conversations with David, he had not even mentioned that. A Parcero for the Amiga 500 would match my needs perfectly. So I immediately contacted David, and he confirmed it was something he was working on. The board was designed and built, but he was working on finalizing a case design. If interested, he would finish a case and send me one at a small discount for being the first user. I immediately agreed, and he had it finished and mailed to me within a few days. I had just received the device a few days prior to the recording of this episode, but I pulled out my Amiga 500 and plugged in the Parcero. My Amiga booted up in a few seconds with no floppies required. Just like with the Amiga 1000, David includes an SD card with tons of software on it, including a WHD load launcher that makes running the software super easy. My Amiga 500 now has a total of 9 meg of RAM with the 1 meg of internal and front slot memory and 8 meg from the Parcero, and a virtual hard disk, and is a true joy to use. My experiences now with the Amiga 1000 and 500 plus Parcero have really made me a fan of the Amiga platform, something I had never experienced before. Okay, next up, a quick mention of a case that I picked up. The XEP82 is a device for the Atari 8-bit XL XE computers that gives you 80 columns for certain software. It's a remake and improvement of the original Atari XEP80 80-column video adapter. The Brewing Academy, which makes the XEP82, also 3D prints the cases for them. I picked one up from there that also matches my tiny XL Computer Remake 576 NUC device, which I mentioned on the show before. So the NUC sits on top of the XEP80 or vice versa and looks great. Next up, some bling for Floppy Days. With the upcoming Vintage Computer Show season upon us, I had a need to update some of the materials that I take to the show when I have an exhibit table. I had a banner poster with Floppy Days, Antic, and TRS-80 Trash Talk made many years ago that I've been taking to shows. I also had a Floppy Days t-shirt printed that I've been wearing to the shows. Both had a need to be updated. I haven't been a co-host on Trash Talk for some time, and the t-shirt's getting worn, let alone the fact that it shrunk over time and doesn't fit as well as I'd like. Besides, I really prefer golf shirts over t-shirts. They look nicer and fit better than t-shirts. So I jumped back over to Vistaprint, where I had the banner and t-shirt originally made, and looked at my options. I decided to go with smaller, separate signs for Floppy Days and Antic, and have them printed on foam board instead of an extremely wide poster. They're easier to display, transport, and store between shows. I'm very happy with the design that I did for the signs and the golf shirt. Look me up at the next show and let me know what you think. Another item I purchased was one actually for the latest computer that's being covered right now, the ZX Spectrum. It's called Over the Spectrum by Philip Williams, one of the series being reproduced by Retro Reproductions. The description says, Over the Spectrum was first published in 1982 and at the time was considered one of the best introductions to programming on Sir Clive Sinclair's incredible new home computer. Many who went on to have long careers in the computer industry started with the programs in this excellent book. As such, it's not only a great reprint for purposes of nostalgia, but also a practical and helpful guide to anyone interested in the programming of retro games. Finally, another Sinclair-related item, this time for the ZX80, 81, and Timex Sinclair 1000 line. Some time ago, I purchased an upgrade for my Timex Sinclair 1000 called the ZX Band Plus, which is an SD card, storage, sound, and joystick interface. A gentleman on Sell My Retro was offering a case for this device, and I purchased it, putting a cover on yet another otherwise bare board. The case fit absolutely perfectly, and I love having the board protected. And that's it for new acquisitions this month.
Hi, I'm Chris Smith, author of the ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Retro Games Limited, behind such products as the C64 Mini Full Size and the A500 Mini. This is the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, next we're going to talk about upcoming shows. Now that we're in April, several shows have already happened this month. April is a very busy month. There is one more yet this month, at least as of the recording of this podcast, and that is the Indie Classic Computer and Video Game Expo. That's the weekend of April 29th and 30th at the Crown Plaza Airport Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. I am involved in the planning of this, so please come out and come and visit the show if you can. In June, the 64 Bits or Less Retro Gaming Festival, June 3rd to the 4th, at the Benton County Fairgrounds in Corvallis, Oregon, sponsored by the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. Also in June is the BoatFest Vintage Computer Exposition, June 23rd through the 25th in Hurricane, West Virginia. The same weekend is VCF Southwest, June 23rd through the 25th at the Davidson Gundy Alumni Center at University of Texas at Dallas, Richardson, Texas. And also the same weekend, so 3 shows the same weekend, the Pacific Commodore Expo Northwest, version 4, June 24th to the 25th at the Interim Computer Museum in Seattle, Washington. In July, Kansas Fest, the largest and longest running annual Apple II conference, July 18th through the 23rd at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri. They are going to have both an on-site and virtual version of these running this year. Southern Fried Gaming Expo and VCF Southeast is July 28th through the 30th in Atlanta, Georgia. In August 12th is Zap Live 2023 at the Holiday Inn, Kenilworth, CV8, 1ED in the UK. In September, there's VCF Midwest, September 9th through the 10th at the Waterford Banquets and Conference Center in Elmhurst, Illinois. Tandy Assembly is September 29th through October 1st at the Courtyard by Marriott in Springfield, Ohio. Amy West, October 14th through the 15th in Sacramento, California, which is an Amiga show. And the Portland Retro Gaming Expo is the same weekend, October 13th through the 15th, at the Oregon Convention Center in Portland, Oregon. And finally, the World of Commodore, December 2nd through the 3rd, at the Admiral Inn, Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. And that's it for shows that I'm aware of remaining in 2023.
Hello, I am Alessandro Grussu. I am the author of Spectrumpedia, the most comprehensive book about the ZX Spectrum, and you are listening to Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, now we get into the main topic of the show, where we will be covering several topics about the ZX Spectrum, beginning with books. And again, the co-host is PJ Evans. Okay, so the next category we're going to talk about, PJ, has to do with books for the ZX Spectrum. And as you might expect for a machine that was as popular as this machine was, there are a ton of books out there. I mean, I went out to the World of Spectrum site, which has an archive of books, and they have no less than 2,000 books listed there. So, I mean, obviously there's a huge number of these things created. So I just wanted to kind of give a high-level overview of the books that were available, maybe some of the books I have in my library, maybe some of the books you have in your library, and just in general help the listeners understand, what are the books, if you've got a ZX Spectrum, what are the books that you want to try to acquire and have in your library, just because, you're probably going to need them in order to use the machine effectively.
Yes, that's right. If there were incredible amount of books, I think it was helped by the fact that one of the main routes to market for all the 8-bit home computers back then were newsagents. We had a big chain of newsagents, like John Menzies and W.H. Smith's in the UK, and they were really, by the independent computer shops, they were the ones that carried the computers, because we're sort of before the days of massive retail outlets selling these things in the UK. So being newsagents, big newsagents, they also were bookshops as well. So it was no surprise that, in these pre-internet days, there were many, many books available to learn about how to program your ZX Spectrum, covering all manner of topics.
One set of books that I wanted to talk about is a company called Retro Reproductions. And they have, over the last couple of years, started reproducing or republishing a lot of the books that were produced back in the 80s. as you might guess, since we're talking about the Spectrum, they did come out with a couple of Spectrum books that I have acquired. I bought them on Amazon. One of them is called Spectrum Machine Language for the Absolute Beginner by William Tang, which was first published in '82. I assume they're focusing on ones that were really popular or were some of the best books that were available back in the day.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, and the Machine Language for the Absolute Beginner was a bit of a classic. I struggled a bit, if I'm honest. I was never an assembler programmer. But that was a very, very popular book back in the day.
And then the other one that they published that I just purchased is called Over the Spectrum by Philip Williams. And it also was first published in 1982. And it was considered one of the best introductions to programming on the ZX Spectrum. Are you familiar with this one too?
Yes, this was also very, very popular, and it was sort of like a recipe book, if you like. If you wanted to do a certain thing on the ZX Spectrum in BASIC, it was like how do I approach this particular problem? You'd find an example in there about how to do it, and that would point you in the right direction.
Okay, well, those, I've got both of those in my library. I think those are excellent books to acquire. We have links in the show notes to those if you want to get those. There were, as we said, there were a lot of other books. Since the Spectrum was so popular for games, there are lots and lots and lots of books about the best games for the machine. And I did a search on Amazon and came up with a lot of different books around gaming on the Spectrum. There's one called the Spectrum Games Bible from 82 to 84 by P. Johns, and the ZX Spectrum Games Code Club, which is 20 fun games to code and learn by Gary Plowman.
Oh yeah, that's a great book.
Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah. That was a sort of a self-published, crowdfunded book that came out a few years ago. And it was just, the guy took a great approach to it. He was just having fun and said, well, maybe some other people can have fun as well, and decided to self-publish this book. And it really is a cracker. If you want to especially if you want to do some games programming, it's great fun.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next is Spectrumpedia by Alessandro Grussu, who was one of my co-hosts for a couple of these episodes. His book is a great reference as far as the history, the full history, basically everything about the ZX Spectrum. And it was originally written in Italian, but there's an English translation for both Volume 1 and Volume 2.
That doesn't surprise me because the ZX series of computers were incredibly popular in Italy. It was sort of the second market after the UK. So still to this day, there's a lot of love for it over there. And
then there were a couple of other modern books that have come out pretty recently. One that I actually haven't read yet, but I want to sit down and read this someday. It's called The Micro Kids, an 80s adventure with the ZX Spectrum, the Commodore 64, and more. And it was also written by Gary Plowman. But it was written and produced in 2018. And you can even get an audio book version of this on Audible if you want to. But if you want to read a story about a kid growing up in the 80s and having a ZX Spectrum, it might be something you might get a kick out of. Yeah, I'm very ashamed to say I'm not familiar with it. Although Gary also did the book we were talking about a moment ago, the Code Club. So I'm going to go and check this out. It sounds like I might relate to it a bit more than maybe I'm happy about. And then, of course, the ZX Spectrum Ula, How to Design a Microcomputer by Chris Smith, who, again, was another co-host for a couple of the episodes on Floppy Days. So take a look at his book if you want to know how the ULA works, and he tells you all about it.
Yeah, this is considered an absolute classic in the ZX community. Because ZX Spectrum, one of its great cost-saving ideas was to create this custom chip, Universal Logic Array, or ULA. It's one of the big pains of trying to fix a ZX Spectrum because they haven't been made since the 1980s or late 90s, early 90s, sorry. And if that goes bang, which they do, then you've got to source an old part to replace it. But that aside, it was a work of genius to put that device, which sort of brought together things like the video, the sound, the memory control, and all the interfacing with the Z80, all into this one device. And it was, of course, Sinclair at that point went telling anybody what was going on in there, and then this book comes out that explains the entire thing. And without that book, we would really have a hard time restoring ZX Spectrums, getting the most out of them, and also now we've been able to create new versions of the ULA so we can keep these machines running. So it really is a very important book in history.
Absolutely. So that's all of the books that that I'm aware of and wanted to talk about, either from my library or through a little bit of searching. Any other books that you've got in your library, PJ, that you wanted to mention real quick here before we move into a different topic?
Yeah, there's one that comes immediately to mind, which is called Sinclair ZX Spectrum, A Visual Compendium. It was, again, a crowdsourced book by Bitmap Books, which are a great place to check out, Bitmap Books Co. UK. And it was a Kickstarter, and I was one of the people who had decided to stump up my money and take the risk. And I was very well rewarded with a beautiful book that covers classic games, interviews, the magazines, the scene, beautifully printed. And for the Kickstarters, it came with a whole wealth of extras of bookmarks and stickers and a CD of reinterpretations of classic theme tunes as well. So if you can get hold of a copy of that, it doesn't have an author as such because it's more of a collection, but the man behind it was a guy called Sam Dyer. And it's very well worth checking out if you can find a copy of it. Also, you've got Chris Wilkins, who's quite a presence in the more modern age of the ZX Spectrum, and he has the rights now to Crash, which was the seminal magazine, and we now have regular Crash annuals and quarterly Crash magazines come back, and a lot of the original authors are also still writing for it, so that's really great to see. So I'd recommend checking those out as well.
All right, perfect. All right, we're going to move on to the topic of software. And again, just as in books, because of the popularity of the machine, there is a massive amount of software, particularly in the category of games. That's where you're going to really find a lot of information, a lot of software that's available. There are a couple of places actually that I found that had very large archives of Spectrum software. One is at the World of Spectrum.org. They've got a massive archive there that you can download. And there's also the archive at archive.org. They have archives there for, just about all of the machines from that period out there. And they've got a ZX Spectrum set as well. So, there's thousands of pieces of software in that archive. So it's fairly large to download, but, with today's speeds, internet speeds, who cares, right? It's not.
Yes.
So it's a few gigabytes, no biggie. So that's a good way to, if you get software, run that on an emulator or stick it on a SD card and run it on your modern machine or your ZX Spectrum using a modern disk emulator. And that's a terrific way to do it. So I also found a list of the top 10 games that were available. Now, this is, if you you could go to 10 different sites probably, and you're going to get a different list of what the top 10 pieces of software were. But
I've got the list. You sent the list over to me.
Yeah.
now and going, nope, that's completely wrong.
I think there are certain pieces of software that probably are universally agreed to be, very, very good, very good games to check out, if you've got a Spectrum. Yeah. But, others obviously it's going to be arguable whether they're top 10 software or not. Elite is one of those that seem to show up everywhere that, everyone seemed to agree was a very good piece of software. Would you agree that that's one of the top games?
Randy, the hours I lost to that game. The hours and hours. And I was never any good at it, but you better believe as soon as they announced Elite Dangerous, I was right on that beta list. And, if you've played Elite Dangerous, the modern interpretation of it, all I can say is for an 80s kid, I can now see it how it looked in my head at the time. Where back then you had these little wireframe graphics. In this list you found, it's at number 1. I can see why that is. It became famous on the BBC Micro. And I think previously I mentioned that I got an Acorn Electron, which is like the miniature version of the BBC Micro, because I could get Elite on it. Because everyone said it's impossible to port Elite to a ZX Spectrum. It just couldn't get it running on a Z80 processor. Until, of course, they did. And arguably we did a better job of it. And so hours and hours on that game. Absolutely amazing. So a procedurally generated universe in under 48K with hundreds of planets to visit and trading between them. One of the things, if you're a real geek for these sort of things, check it out. There is a GitHub repository of the original Elite source code for the BBC Model B, and someone has gone through and annotated it line by line. So if you ever want an insight into how on earth they crammed this into 32K on the BBC Model B, check that out. Just Google for that. It's fascinating. I can't claim to understand any of it, but it gives you an idea into how these things came along. And of course, the guy who spearheaded that was a man called David Brabham. Then went on to work with the Raspberry Pi Foundation to create the Raspberry Pi. So we're still...
I didn't realize that. Okay, well, that's cool.
He was part of the original team with Evan Upton, who created Raspberry Pi and got all that off the ground. So, still there, and still to this day, his software house, Frontier, is still producing some amazing stuff. But absolutely Elite deserves a place in the top 10. And I see number 2 we have R-Type. And I can see that because it's considered to be one of the most accurate arcade conversions, because R-Type was an amazing arcade game. And it's sort of later in the ZX Spectrum's history where, new and better computers were starting to appear. But then suddenly this amazing, fast, playable, detailed conversion comes out and just blows everyone away. So absolutely, that should be there. Shall I keep going down them?
Yeah, if you have any comments on any of the other that are listed here and whether you have any familiarity with them, or if there are other games that you think definitely should be in the top 10 list that's not showing here, that would be great also.
Yeah, well, we'll be here all night if we try that, I tell you.
Okay.
But so let's see. At number 3, we have Chucky Egg. Now, Chucky Egg, again, more popular on the BBC Micro. It's quite later on that we got ZX Spectrum conversion for it. But BBC Micro was prevalent in UK classrooms in the early 80s. And someone would always sneak in a tape of Chucky Egg and get it running on all the different machines, and would all spend ages playing Chucky Egg when the teacher wasn't looking. So it was nice to actually finally get a port of that to the Spectrum. It was really good. Now, at 4, we've got an absolute classic, which is Manic Miner. From Bug Byte Software. This was coded by a guy called Matthew Smith, one of probably the most famous ZX Spectrum games author, because he followed that up a few years later, which is shamefully not in this top 10, with Jet Set Willy. And I can put my hand up and say I was actually a beta tester for that game back in the day, because nice. My cousin was working with Matt Smith on developing the game for the Commodore 64. So I lived very near where they were working, so I was able to go and hang out there on occasion and have a play of the software as it was under development, which was quite cool for me because
that is cool.
Yeah, I was a school kid, and it was one of the most anticipated releases of the year. And I was like, oh, yeah, I've had a play with it, going around boasting.
Right.
What I saw most of the time was I'd move a little bit and it'd crash. But yeah, they were great days. So yeah, Manic Miner, absolute classic game. If you play, I would say, if you play one ZX Spectrum game in your life, play that one.
Okay. I see Boulder Dash on here too, which is pretty popular on a lot of platforms.
A lot of platforms, and I wouldn't say so much the Spectrum. It wasn't. I don't remember it being massive on the Spectrum. That was a Commodore 64 game. But yeah, it was ported eventually. But yeah, that's an interesting one. What else we got here? We got Back to School, amazing game, very unusual dynamic. Sort of the mechanics of how the game worked were quite unusual and quite playful. Really worth checking out. Football Manager, it's still going to this day in one form or another. You can get Football Manager for your iPhone. It's very, very different now, but yeah, that was a bit of a legend. And Lunar Jetman, now I would say that's number 8. Lunar Jetman is a superb game, and Ultimate played the game, one of the great software houses of the ZX Spectrum. But I actually prefer its predecessor, which was Jetpack, which came out right at the beginning of it all, and still to this day, you put me down in front of Jetpack and you'll lose me for an hour or two quite happily. And the last one I'll mention at number 9 is good old Horace Goes Skiing. That was one of the launch titles. Hungry Horace was a rather unusual Spectrum character. No one, I don't think to this day, is quite sure what he is. He's sort of a blue bob with either a cape, an arm, or a strange hairstyle, depending on who you ask. Yeah, it's very, very hard to explain. But he had a trilogy of games that were released originally under the Spectrum label, but were actually written by a company called Beam. And Horace Goes Skiing. Hungry Horace was the original one, which was a Pac-Man clone. And Horace and the Spiders was the last one. But yeah, all great fun games, very iconic of the Spectrum genre.
And of course, there was other software. It was not all game software. In the Sinclair catalog from the day on cassette, there was some educational software. There was a ViewCalc, which is a spreadsheet, view file, a database, View 3D modeling program.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, all this came from the fact that Clive Sinclair wanted this to be an educational device. He believed it could be a business device. He wasn't that keen on games. He famously was a bit annoyed that it took off as a games platform, didn't really see the opportunity there. So, yes, it was launched. I mean, obviously, because you've got to convince the parents as well. You've got to show the parents there's going to be some value in this, and the kids aren't just going to play games all the time, which is, of course, exactly what they did.
Right.
So let's have a big bunch. And normally when you bought it, you got this big pack of educational software with it, with its history and geography and things like that, and Make a Chip and Survival are the two that, probably the most common pieces of software you can find for the ZX Spectrum. But I had ViewCalc and View 3D. So ViewCalc was a very basic spreadsheet. And when I say basic, when you put in the values and put in a formula, it didn't update the values automatically. You then had to go and say recalculate, and it would go off before showing you what the results were. So it was pretty horrible to use. And View 3D, same thing. Yes, you could make 3D models in it, but you had to be extremely patient to actually see the results. And in terms of what was a practical application of that, nothing really. It was just sort of fun to play around with.
So one thing that seems to be missing from here that I didn't see a lot of as I was doing research was any sort of word processing. Was word processing a use case that was ever done much on a Spectrum? And were there some really good word processors out there?
Actually, yes. And I used to do some of my homework nerdily on the ZX Spectrum because I was lucky enough to have a Centronics interface so I could hook it up to a decent dot matrix printer. And the king of them all was TASWord. And there was TASWord, then TASWord 2. And that was actually quite a capable word processor, perfectly usable. Of course, if you didn't have a Spectrum Plus, typing for any length of time on the original rubber key Spectrum wasn't a great experience. But TASWord and TASWord 2.
Tazword, T-A-Z?
TAS.
Ah, TAS. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
And I think there's a copy of it behind me. Yeah, there is.
Well, I figured there probably was something, every platform had one or more, really good word processors. So I figured there had to be something out there. Okay, let's move on to ads and appearances. So one of the sites I like to check as we're talking about this is starringthecomputer.com, which talks about each platform, what TV shows and movies or whatever that they might have been shown in at any point in time. The Spectrum seems to have shown up in quite a few different, like I said, different TV shows and movies. Black Mirror, Bandersnatch, which is actually fairly recently, 2018. Oh. The Spectrum. This is the original Spectrum that was shown there. It was also a ZX Spectrum Plus in that same show. How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. I'm not even familiar with some of these.
That's a very good film starring Simon Pegg. It's quite funny.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. Let's talk about Bandersnatch for a bit, because that was fascinating. It's quite recent, 2018. It's on Netflix, and you can only watch it on Netflix because it's quite a unique thing. It's a choose-your-own adventure. So you start watching it, and as you're watching it, you'll be given decisions to make. So, for instance, towards the beginning, we have our hero who goes to this software house, which is basically Imagine Play the Game, which is one of the big ZX Spectrum software houses, but they've given it a different name. And he has an interview, and then it pops up, do I take the job, yes or no? And depending on what you answer on your remote, it goes off on a different path, shows you a different bit of video, and on it goes. So just like a sort of choose-your-own adventure. But there's ZX Spectrum in-jokes laced all the way through it. Firstly, there's several mentions of the Imagine software house, and Bandersnatch, the actual title, comes from a famous lost ZX Spectrum game. Because Imagine they went nuts. They were giving everyone Ferraris and champagne for breakfast. They were not very careful with their money, and eventually went bankrupt. And at that time, they were spending a lot of time developing Bandersnatch for ZX Spectrum, which was going to come with a plug-in for the peripheral bus at the back, which gave it more capability. That I think it had a music chip in it, more memory, enable it to actually run the game. And sadly, it was never completed. Although echoes of it came later on in some in the Frankie Goes to Hollywood game and some Atari ST games later on. Some code was reused. But yeah, it's a real, that Black Mirror episode is a real sort of love letter to the ZX Spectrum scene by Charlie Brooker.
Well, cool. Okay, I did not know that. I had seen that series on Netflix. I have Netflix. I have a subscription to Netflix, but I have not seen that particular episode.
It's quite funny because someone I mentioned earlier on, although I got his name slightly wrong, I said Chris Westcott. His name's Matt Westcott, otherwise known as Gasman. He's still very active in the ZX Spectrum community. In fact, he owns a gigantic ZX Spectrum, which is about 6 foot across. By about
6 foot across, a Spectrum?
Yeah, and it works. You can play it. And massive, so you can press.
Why?
Well, he would say, why not? So he was, for the Bandersnatch episodes, they wanted to have a game they were working on, and it was called Nosedive. And they made a little demo up of it, but then they thought, wouldn't it be fun if we actually turn this into an actual game? And they approached him, and he actually wrote the game Nosedive. And if you know where to look, they hide it a little bit, but if you know where to look, you can find the website where you can download it and play it yourself. And it'll even work on an original ZX Spectrum.
Huh. I was just going to say the ZX Spectrum Plus was on an episode of Doctor Who as well, which...
I didn't spot this, because I've seen that episode. Yeah. Flux. Yeah, Halloween Apocalypse. I've seen that, and I didn't spot the Spectrum in it.
Yeah, pretty weird. I mean, it was just a couple years ago. So 2021.
I'll have to go back and rewatch it.
So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is just basically what did the ads look like, back in the day when they were actually advertising the ZX Spectrum. I pulled up a couple just to take a look at them because it can give you a good idea of what was the company focusing on when they were marketing the machine. What were they focused on? How were they trying to sell this machine? And price. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And the one ad that I pulled up here, it's a comparison chart between the ZX Spectrum and the BBC Micro, the VIC-20, the Atari 400, the TI-99 4A, and the TRS-80 color computer. And, of course, the ZX Spectrum comes in quite a bit cheaper than all of those other machines, whereas, and then it shows all of the, all of the characteristics, it matches up pretty well, with those machines. So obviously they were trying to focus on the fact that the ZX Spectrum, a lot of power, but very inexpensive, especially compared to the competition.
Yeah, so they've got this sort of matrix chart of features, and it is quite skewed to favour the ZX Spectrum.
Yeah, of course.
Also, the Commodore 64 is very conspicuous by its absence in that.
It is. You're right. It is. Instead, they compared it to the VIC-20, which is not a very fair comparison. That's not a very powerful machine.
Not at all. Not at all. But it does make the fair point that the VIC-20 was £190 then, but you could get a Spectrum for 125.
Yeah.
So that's fair game, I think. But yes, they've got things like, so for instance, Sound Generator has got a tick across all of them, even though I think looking at it, I think the ZX Spectrum is probably the most inferior, seeing as it could just do a single beep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, but as I say, it was all about price. That's what Clive Sinclair went for over everything, was let's make this as cheap as possible. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there isn't even an on and off switch on the original Spectrum because that was at a necessary cost where you could switch it off at the wall.
Yeah, down at the bottom of the ad, it says, elegant, effective, unique, less than half the price of its nearest competitor, and more powerful. So, it's always fun to look at those ads.
Yeah.
I was a little surprised when I saw what they were comparing it to. It's like, okay, you're comparing it to some machines that weren't even the most powerful within their own platform, right? Like you said, VIC-20 versus, why not the Commodore 64? TRS-80 color computer, that was probably the color computer 1 in the first version that they were comparing to. And
on the BBC Micro, they compare it with the Model A, which I think they sold about 10 of them. Some Model B, which sold tens of thousands. They avoid things like peripheral interfaces because the Spectrum has one, and you generally have to buy some kind of box to interface with another device, whereas the BBC, for instance, came with a whole host of printer, user port, and hard disk interfaces all ready to go. So apples and oranges, really.
And there was, I found a famous quote from Clive Sinclair that I thought was interesting, because of the BBC Micro. And, I know Sinclair tried to have his machines be the ones that the BBC put their backing behind, right?
That's right.
And he said, we believe the BBC makes the world's best TV programs and that Sinclair makes the world's best computers. So he's kind of getting a little dig in there, it seems to me.
Oh, well, he was furious about that. And, we were talking about in the movies, well, one thing to check out on YouTube is Micromen, which is a movie all about the BBC things. So very, very briefly, the BBC put out a tender to say, we want to make a BBC computer. We're not going to do it ourselves. Who can do it? And it turned into a race between Sinclair and Acorn Computers, which was Sinclair's old colleague and now rival, Chris Curry. and it went right down to the wire. And Acorn designed what was then became the BBC microcomputer and got it working and won the competition. Whereas Sinclair had anticipated his Spectrum being in classes around the world. Now, looking at the build of the Spectrum, it wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. The good thing about a BBC Model B, if you see one, you can throw it out of a second-story window and it'll be absolutely fine.
Yeah. They're sturdy machines and extremely flexible in terms of upgradability and things like that. So.
Absolutely. I mean, the right computer definitely won that. But when Chris Curry published a bit of a sniffy advert about the ZX Spectrum in the newspapers, there was a famous scene in a pub in Cambridge where Sinclair chased him round with a rolled-up newspaper.
I'm chasing a dog who made a mess, right?
Yeah, and so if you see Micromen, there's apparently very accurate retelling of that scene.
Yeah, I've seen that movie. I like that movie.
Yeah, it's great.
All right, let's move into what's my favorite topic. I love talking about modern upgrades. Every machine I have, I like to get what are the best modern upgrades out there, particularly virtual disk drives. Got to have virtual disk drive, any RAM expansions that might be available, and then whatever can give you the very best video, out of a machine. Those are like the first things that I always go after whenever I get a new computer in my collection. So the ZX Spectrum has lots of upgrades available. You can get today really, you can really beef it up and make it very fun to work with. One of the things that I'm aware of is a ZX. So on the audio front, there's a ZX-AY external stereo audio interface to improve the audio capabilities of the Spectrum. So I don't actually have this upgrade. Is this something you're familiar with, PJ?
Yeah, I don't have one. Quite familiar with it. So one of the Spectrum's worst aspects of it's what it had over its predecessor, ZX81, was the sound. So you've basically got a little buzzer that can go beep. Now, if you're very clever, which sort of many developers were, you can make it do a bit more than that. If you ever played the game Furlight, it opens with a beautiful little piece of medieval sounding music and there's chords in there and multiple lines. How they did it, I've no idea, with this tiny little speaker. Now, the later 128K model brought in the infamous AY chip, which was already in many other microcomputers, and I believe is still being manufactured today, which could give you a much wider range of sounds, free channel audio interface, and all the rest of it. So it comes as no surprise that someone's actually created an add-on to actually give this capability to the original ZX Spectrum. So it upgrades it to the 128K spec in that respect. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's the key thing, is that it allows you to take your early model machine and make it have some capabilities of the later model machines. So, very nice. Something I may try to acquire one of these days, although I'm not that big into sound capabilities on these machines, so I'm not sure whether that's anything I'll go after or not. Something I am very interested in, though, as I mentioned, video upgrades and getting the best possible video out of my original ZX Spectrum, and I have a +2 as well, and that's how can you get the best capability out of a machine? Now, the +2 actually has an RGB out connector, so it's pretty easy to get like an RGB to SCART connector, and then go up to HDMI with that, and I've got that. But the original Spectrum, there's actually a ZX HDMI interface. I don't have one of these yet, but I'm kind of drooling over this thing. It allows you to connect your Spectrum to a modern TV through HDMI. You don't have to modify your Spectrum in any way. You can get games with 64 colors, with ULA Plus, 128 video memory support. Pretty cool little device, it looks like to me. Now, do you have one of these?
I don't. I've got around that issue. My daily driver is a ZX Spectrum Next, and that has HDMI natively. So I know it's not absolute genuine, but it's as close as you can get really in this day and age with the FPGA version of the ZX Spectrum 48K. And yes, I've got a +2 and a SCART cable for that as well. It's a double-edged sword, really. It fascinates me, this, because, it's very convenient. And, anyone who looks after CRT monitors know what an absolute pain they can be. Very temperamental beasts as they're getting older. But I kind of like the fuzz a little bit. It feels more genuine to me. And, of course, a lot of graphics designers, designed to take advantage of it. And to make things look in a certain way because they're expecting that kind of smudge you get on a CRT. So it's I think it's swings and roundabouts. But I use HDMI out of the Next to get this. But no, I haven't got one of these, and I probably should put it on my shopping list.
Yeah, I mean, it looks really interesting. Now, my machine is modified to have composite out, so the video isn't too bad on it, but the idea of being able to have HDMI coming out of my Spectrum 48K just sounds like a pretty cool thing. And the fact that you don't have to modify your machine in any way, it just connects to the edge connector. And it even has an additional connector on the back so you can connect other things to it.
Yeah. That's good. Just for the benefit of any listeners who may not know, one of the nice things, if you do acquire an original ZX Spectrum and you're having trouble with the RF video out, that if you know what you're doing with a soldering iron, it's about a 10-minute job to convert that output to composite output. And if you're careful, it's reversible as well. But you basically just need to clip a wire, put another wire in, and you've got composite out from that interface. So that's something I generally do. Because I don't have any CRTs that work anymore.
Yeah. No, I didn't actually do the mod on this. A friend of mine did, but, it's got the mod on it, and it works fairly well. Now, this next one is a storage alternative. So, I do have one of these. It's called the DivMMC. It's SD-based, compatible with all the Sinclair machines. You can put tons and tons of software on an SD card and load them right into your ZX Spectrum. I think everybody should have one of these.
I think it's a good choice. This is the DivMMC Future from Future 8.
Yeah.
And the guy who designed it was fed up with the various alternatives. There was quite a few models, and then if you were changing from a 48K to a 128K, you had to change jumpers and all the rest of it. He said, no, I'm going to design one that just works. And he went that extra mile and got an injection molded case made for it. So it's not like a sort of icky 3D printed case or anything like that, or just bare bones. And it's a really beautifully made piece of hardware. And I think it's almost an essential purchase if you're serious about your retro gaming for the Spectrum to get one of these. Because you can have thousands of games. You just press a button and load it up right away.
And it comes with a case. It's got the nice little rainbow stripe on it, so it matches your machine. Yep. And it's pretty cool. And I've had a lot of success with it. Yeah,
you've got a Kempston joystick port built into it as well. So
exactly.
That's really good thinking to put that in there.
Yeah. There is another one available I don't have. It's called Div IDE, which uses a compact flash card instead of an SD card. Mm-hmm. I assume it's still made, but I think
you can download the plans for it and make one yourself if you want to. But to be honest with you, DivMMC and then DivMMC Future have pretty much taken over. So the IDE is a bit of an older device now.
Right. From a networking perspective, there is something called the SpectraNet. It's an Ethernet interface for your ZX Spectrum. You can connect then to TNFS servers over the internet or IRC or that sort of thing, or you can play multiplayer games.
Yes, there's not many of them, but yes, they are out there.
Yeah. There's one that I found that was referenced called Spec Tank.
Yes,
which is a multiplayer 4-person game. But I don't know. Are you familiar with the FujiNet that is being created for a lot of different platforms?
Yes.
I expect one of these days that the FujiNet will be available also for the Spectrum platform, and then the SpectraNet probably will go to the wayside, I would imagine, at that point. But the FujiNet's really cool and is available for at least 3 different platforms already, and I'm sure the ZX Spectrum is coming.
Yeah, I've seen a SpectraNet. I don't have one myself, but I've seen one working, and it's very odd when you get the classic start of the ZX Spectrum, where it comes up with a black screen, and instead of copyright 1982 Sinclair Research Limited, it comes up with your IP address. And that's a very odd thing to see on a ZX.
Right.
But I've seen people have a lot of fun with them, yes.
Any other modern upgrades that are pretty popular that I missed here?
Nothing comes to mind. As I say, the DivMMC Future is probably my favourite. It's just so easy to use, and it, as I say, it just works, which is all you can ask, was what you ideally want. I think we've pretty much covered the good stuff.
Okay, let's talk about emulation a little bit. I mean, some people like to run emulation. Maybe they don't have a Spectrum. Maybe you just want to do something real quick and you want to fire up an emulator and go that route. One of these days, we're probably all going to have to use emulation for all these machines because they're just not going to work anymore. So what are the most popular emulators that are available for whatever platform or platforms you like to run today? We just wanted to run through some things real quick. One that I found that seems to be really popular is called Spectaculator. It's actually a paid emulator. You have to purchase it, but it's available for Windows, iOS, and Android.
That's right. Yeah, no, Spectaculator is absolutely brilliant. And it's I can't remember exactly how much it is. I did buy a license for it a few years ago, and would happily do so again. It's so many features in it. It's nice and easy to use. It's very well presented. So what I would say as a caveat is the iOS version. So you used to be able to put your own software on it. It was quite easy to do, but Apple have now closed that loophole. So if you get a Spectaculator, there's only a certain amount of games you can run on it. So it comes with some games that the developers have kindly allowed them to ship with it, and there are also some packs you can buy. For it's pennies. It's like $1 or something to buy like a pack of 5 games. But you are stuck with those games. So if you've got a game you want to run on the iOS version, there's no straightforward way at the moment to put that, upload that to your iOS device.
Yeah, Apple's real picky about that sort of thing on their phone and tablets. I will have to say I don't agree with their stance on that, but
can't say I do either.
If you don't like it, you can always jailbreak your phone or your tablet and go that route, I guess.
Yeah. Or you can get an Android phone where you can do whatever you like on it.
I won't be going that route, but yeah, that is certainly something that you could do. And there is an Android version of Spectaculator as well.
Yes, which doesn't have those kind of restrictions. So
yeah,
it's a great piece. It's a great piece of software. I think it's great.
Another one that I came across is called Fuse. It seems to be very cross-platform. There's Windows, Mac, Linux, Amiga OS, even you got Amiga OS 4, Android. So it's available for a lot of different platforms, and it seems like a pretty popular one. Have you used this one?
For years and years and years. Fuse is amazing. It's not the kindest interface in the world, but it's really, really good. And the emulation is extremely accurate. And what's great is, as you just mentioned, they have so many peripherals that you can just enable with tick box. So things I was talking about earlier, like the Current Microspeech. So if you want to make your Spectrum sound like Stephen Hawking on a bad day, you can just switch that on and it'll work. And joystick, it's got good joystick interfaces. So one project I think I mentioned earlier that I keep coming back to is I keep getting hold of old Spectrum keyboard cases and using a Raspberry Pi to read the keyboard matrix and run an emulator. And I always use Fuse to do that. It's the most flexible one for doing that, and it works really, really well. And it's open source, so you're download it, compile it if you want to. It's a one-line install for Mac OS and Windows. Yeah, thoroughly recommend it.
Very, very, very powerful, it looks like. It even emulates, the DivMMC that we talked about. It'll emulate the SpectraNet network interface. Yeah, it looks like it's really flexible and really powerful.
Yeah, it's been around for a long time, so it's really mature.
Another one that I came across is called Speccy. Runs on Windows, Linux, and Android. It will emulate most of the different models of the ZX Spectrum, as well as the Timex Sinclair models. It also supports the joysticks and mouse, both the ZX Spectrum and Kingston. It'll emulate the printers, both the ZX printer and the Timex Alphacom 32 printer. Sound support. So that looks like another one that if you're a Windows or Linux user, it might be a way to go.
Yeah. It's not one I've played with extensively. I'm aware of it, but I haven't spent a lot of time with it.
Well, I mean, to be honest, if you use Fuse or if you use one of these other ones and it works well for you, you're probably not going to install, multiple emulators unless one of them does one thing you want to do on occasion and the other one does something else that you want to do on occasion. But typically you're going to find one that works well for your use cases and you're going to install that one. So yeah, sounds like Fuse is a really, really good one. There's one called 81, which is an older emulator that's Windows only. It will emulate the ZX 80 and 81, all the Spectrum machines, the Jupiter Ace, the Timex Sinclair machines, and various add-on cards. So,
I used to use this a lot, mainly for ZX 80 and 81 and Jupiter Ace emulation. So the Jupiter Ace, it's kind of related to the ZX 80 and 81, but not. They share a designer in common. But that's a whole. That you could do a whole episode on Jupiter Ace. It's quite a fascinating story. So yeah, it's really good. If you want those more rarer machines like the Ace, that's the one to go for.
Another one is called Retro Virtual Machine.
No, I've got to give a shout out for this one. It's one of my favourites. Yeah, so sorry, I feel I interrupted there.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say it runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux, so all the major platforms. It is kept current. It's still under development. Emulates a lot of different machines, not just the Spectrum. Also emulates the Amstrad, MSX, SG-1000, Sega Master System. It says you can drag and drop a file with your entire collection on the machine, and it's available then to your emulator. Sounds like a really cool emulator.
This I'm a Mac OS user, so
me too.
This is my go-to for if I just want a quick bit of Spectrum or a quick bit of Amstrad. This is my go-to device. It's just really well thought out, and more than anything, the developer had a lot of fun putting it together because it's very colourful. You've got like a beautiful tape deck and the keyboard there. And as you say, it's really good at library management, and you can create different configurations of machines. So I can have a ZX Spectrum with this, and this, and a 128 with this, and this, and I want that particular type of Amstrad. I want a 6128 Amstrad here, and I can just jump between them really quickly. It's amazing. It's free, actually. It's really, really good.
There are a couple of emulators. So if you are a Unix user, if that's your primary platform is Unix, it's called ZX.
How
do you pronounce this? How do you pronounce this?
ZX, ZX.
ZX.
ZX, maybe.
Yeah.
It's it's been bubbling along for a few years now. Well, actually, it's saying here 2015, so longer than I thought. So yeah, I think this is one that's really sort of targeted at the Unix world. It's been a long time since I've had a look at it, to be honest with you.
There's also one available strictly for Android called ZX Spectrum for Android. And then there are a couple of browser-based, which are always fun because they're pretty platform independent. As long as you've got a good web browser on that platform, you can run your emulator right there in the browser. And there is one called JS Speccy. That seems to be really good.
I seem to remember it's open source as well, so you can actually, if you want to sort of create your own version of it or play around with it, or have it even embedded on your own website, you can.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. But yeah, I've used that a few times. Seems to work really, really well. And the fact you can, on the website, I think you can upload your own tap files, your own tape images. If you've got something that, something you wrote back in the 80s or something like that, and you want to see it run again, you can.
Yeah, that's such a great way to do it, especially if you just want to do some emulation real quick, and just bringing it up in your browser and running it, and not have to worry about installing anything, and it's a really great way to go. And the thing is, the modern browsers with the JavaScript capability that they have, you can do these sorts of things today. It's just amazing. You can emulate all these old machines.
I've been dabbling in the web since really its inception, since the early 90s, and the idea that you can do this in a web browser still astounds me.
Yeah, pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other emulators that you're aware of or that you wanted to point out? I think that's a pretty good list.
I think that's a very good list. Another one, if you're looking for a particular bit of functionality, and another open source one's quite good, is ZXSP, which when I've want to do some certain things, it's been the one that's worked. But my addling brain won't tell me what those things were.
I was going to say, is there a particular use case for using that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now. I know I still use it because I've just checked. I've still got it installed. So,
okay.
I just think. Oh, that's right. It does ZX81 really well. That's what I liked about it.
Okay.
Yeah. So ZXSP, that's Mac and Linux.
Great. All right. Awesome. All right. So let's talk about what's it like if you want to buy one today. How hard is it to get one? How rare are they? What's it probably going to cost you in order to acquire one? And the answer is a little bit different, I think, depending on where you live. Right, in the U.S., these machines are harder to acquire because most of them come from Europe. Right, so you're going to have to buy one probably in Britain or someplace across the pond and get it shipped over here. It's unusual to find one from someone in the U.S., I guess, if you want to get one. But the cost isn't bad. I mean, you can acquire most of these machines, almost any model of the machines, for $100 to $200 US. I mean, they really are not bad in terms of cost, just because there were so many of them made. I think I bought, so my ZX Spectrum 48K I got from a friend. He traded me for something else. My Plus 2 I actually bought from someone in Greece, and somebody who sells a lot of these, and I think I paid somewhere in the $150 to $200 range for that Plus 2. But so what about in the UK? I mean, it's probably probably even cheaper for you to get one in the UK, is it not?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a sort of an unremarkable Spectrum, £50, about $60. Yeah, there's plenty of them flying around. The rare one is the original Sinclair 128, before the Armstrong models with the built-in tape deck came along. Because it was, firstly, when that came out, everyone who wanted the Spectrum owned one. So it was only people who really wanted that extra sound chip and capabilities and extra memory who bought them. So that it didn't sell as well. And then its production was cut short because Armstrong wants to do the Model 2. So they tend to, you're looking at around 200 to 300, I reckon now. So that's sort of $250 up to maybe $400 one of those.
Yeah.
What I'd say is anyone's interested in buying the Spectrums, if the advert says untested, don't touch it with a barge pole. Make sure you get one that you've got evidence, you've got visual images of it working. And the one thing that breaks first on most Spectrums is the keyboard membrane. So make sure that you've got some kind of assurance from the buyer that the keyboard is working. If it isn't, that's not the end of the world. Keyboard, brand new and much more hardy keyboard membranes are still being manufactured, and it's about a 15-minute job to replace it. Delicate, but very, very doable, and there's lots of online guides. So maybe if you can get one a little cheaper with a broken keyboard, but the motherboard's okay, then maybe you can fix that up yourself.
Yeah, cool. Okay, very good. All right, let's move into community. So if you're a new Spectrum user and you want to get help from people, you want to have a community of people that you can ask questions, or you can help answer questions. Maybe you're an expert and you can help answer questions from someone else. Where can you go? And there are a lot of places that cater specifically to the Sinclair line of computers, so it's not hard at all to find places where you can get help. On Facebook, if you just do searching for Spectrum, for the word Spectrum, I came up with 4 distinct Facebook groups that will provide help. Spectrum Forever, Spectrum for Everyone, World of Spectrum, and another one called ZX Spectrum. They all have, I'd say, thousands of followers on them. So there are lots of options.
I think I'm a member of all of these.
Yeah.
I think I spend most of my time when I'm looking around on there. I'm not a big Facebook user, but Spectrum Forever, certainly, and World of Spectrum. I would say, I don't want to be controversial, but all I'll say is, like any fandom, there are certain corners of that fandom which are less forgiving than others. So
sure,
before you start participating, have a look around at the forums, make sure everyone's playing nice.
Right.
Generally, I mean, I'm talking like 99% of this community is absolutely wonderful. So very, very helpful. They're a hive of knowledge. I've certainly reached out to them in my role as Sinclair curator for the National Museum of Computing to say, okay, I've got this, and this. Should they go together in one box? And someone says, no, that wasn't printed till October 1984, so that couldn't possibly be right. So there's a hive of knowledge, and very, very friendly too. I'd also mention, if you're interested in trading, one of the best places to buy is Sinclair for Sale, because the group really look after each other and look out for each other and make sure that the transactions go through. So it's, in my experience, it's a much more reliable place than certain auction sites beginning with E that I can think of. So check that one out on Facebook if you're interested in buying Spectrum or buying software.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a better way. I think whenever I'm selling something, I'll try places like that first, because it's a group of people that you're more likely to have success and have a good experience, I guess, when you're trying to sell a machine. Then
tends to be a lot fairer.
And then you don't have all the eBay fees either.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I bought loads of things through Sinclair for sale with, I can't recall ever having an issue.
There also is a ZX Spectrum Code Club on Twitter that I've found. If you're a Twitter user, a lot of people have been moving away from Twitter to something called Mastodon.
Yep.
There are a couple of things on there. There's the ZX Spectrum bot, which is, I think, isn't that the one where you can enter a ZX Spectrum program and it will actually run it and give you the results?
That's exactly right, yes. You can toot it, a ZX Spectrum bit of code. It's got some details in its profile about how to do that. It will then run it and send you back a animated GIF of the output. It's very sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of different platforms that do that, but, for the ZX Spectrum, that's a great way to go. There's another one called Spectrum User.
Yeah.
And so if you're a Mastodon user, a couple places there. There are some other web forums like Atari Age. Atari Age is a great place to go no matter what machine you've got.
Yeah, I always find myself ending up there.
Yeah. But there are several other Spectrum-specific forums that are available. World of Spectrum, Spectrum Computing, and Sinclair's ZX World are ones that I'm aware of and I'm a member of. And lots of places, again, for you to get help and communicate with other users.
Yeah, I mean, they're all very good choices. I've nothing to add to that, really. Especially World of Spectrum. It's sort of the centerpiece. It's had some hard times, but it seems to be back on course now. There's some people out there just waiting to help you.
I did find one ZX Spectrum specific podcast called Our Sinclair, a ZX Spectrum podcast by Amigos Retro Gaming. I've not listened to this podcast. Is this something you're familiar with?
I'm to my shame, I'm not, and I will be checking it out.
Okay. Okay. And then there is a subreddit for ZX Spectrum on Reddit, so that's another place that you can get Spectrum information. So there you go. As far as community goes, those are the main ones that I'm aware of. Anything that I missed there that we should talk about?
I think you got it covered.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still astonishing that here we are in 2023 and there's still all this going on about this little computer from the 80s.
There's a lot, isn't there? It's really amazing. And then current websites. So again, there are a lot of ZX Spectrum specific websites that you can go and get information. You can buy some of these modern upgrades that we talked about, or just finding out information about the Spectrum, maybe the history of the Spectrum or whatever. Byte Delight Shop is one that sells a lot of Spectrum items. I think I bought my DivMMC maybe from them. Byte Delight. Yeah. The Future was 8-bit. I think we mentioned them as well. Yeah. That's another shop.
This guy, this is a one-man show, and the guy is an absolute force of nature. Wonderful guy. If you buy something from him, expect all kinds of weird and wonderful things in the package. I'm just looking at my wonderful Future was 8-bit pen at the moment that I got. He's the guy who designed the DivMMC Future. Also does a lot of things for VIC-20s and Commodore PETs. So regardless of your interest, check out that shop. It's great.
I think I got my RGB to SCART cables from that shop. So yeah, there's a lot there. I think we can definitely recommend both of these shops. You can also get, let's say you need a power supply. I bought my Plus 2. Came with the European adapter on it or connector on it. So I bought a US power supply for it from Retro Game Supply. I think I even bought a replacement power supply for my 48K from there as well. There is, so everybody's familiar with Dr. Steve Vickers, who was involved in the development of the machine. Got a link to his website if you want more information about the history of the Spectrum and his involvement.
He's a very nice guy. I had the privilege of interviewing him last year for the National Museum of Computing with Richard Altweiser, who did a lot of the motherboard design for it. So they were a fascinating pair to talk to.
Is that on the web somewhere?
Yeah, it's on YouTube somewhere. I'll get you the link.
Okay, great.
So you hear about the early days and what it was like working with Clive and what they were trying to do. And both of them went on later to form Jupiter Cantab that made Jupiter Ace, which I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to talk about Jupiter Ace on one of these shows at some time, and very interested in learning more about that machine. There also was an article about John Grant from the Register, and it's called "The First ZX Spectrum Prototype Laid Bare." So if you want to read about that.
And if you're ever in the UK or you're in the UK already and you actually want to see that prototype, it's at the Centre for Computing History in Cambridge.
Yes, awesome. Okay. I've also got a link to the Spectrum show by Paul Jenkinson on YouTube. So that's another place you can get information about the Spectrum. Any other sites about the Spectrum that you utilize a lot that maybe isn't on this list?
Nothing comes immediately to mind. I'll probably, after we've finished this podcast, I'll probably kick myself that I've forgotten something. I'll do a plug for myself that if you're ever interested in converting a ZX Spectrum case into a working emulator with a Raspberry Pi, you can have a look on the Magpie website, where there's a tutorial on how to do that. Worth a look.
Oh yeah, you mentioned that you did some articles.
Yeah.
For Magpie, and I'd like to include the links to those in these show notes as well. If you have those,
I'll make sure you get them,
or at least which particular magazines those were in, so that everybody can read those.
Yeah, sure.
All right, that's pretty much it. I did want to mention, a lot of the information came from a few sites. I wanted to mention those as references. One was the retro8bitcomputers.co.uk. Another one was Wikipedia, of course. They always have a lot of great information. Old-computers.com is another site that I use to get information about machines. And then spectrumcomputing.co.uk has a lot of great information as well, and was utilized in developing some of the information in this podcast. Okay, that's about it, PJ. I think we've about hit the limit of, or at least certainly hit the limit of my knowledge of this machine. So I'm sure you have a lot more in your head, but I would love to come over to the UK sometime and come to the museum you work at and get a personal tour from you.
Of course, anytime.
I really appreciate you taking the time to help go through all this material. There certainly was a lot to cover with the Spectrum. It was a wonderful machine, has a really important place in history, and I'm glad that I'm really happy that you were able to come on and help me talk about it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, and we'll talk to you later.
Okay, thanks, Robbie.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Okay, that's it for this month's show. I want to give out special thanks to PJ Evans for taking the time to talk with me today. He did a great job providing color around the ZX Spectrum content the past couple of episodes. I provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discussed during this podcast. Go to floppydays.com for the full list. I very much encourage you to provide feedback for the show at Apple Podcasts or on the website, via email at floppydays@gmail.com, via Twitter at floppydays, on the Twitter-like Mastodon at floppydays@oldbytes.space, on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays, or on the Discord server, whose link is at floppydays.com. And besides the website and Apple Podcasts, Floppy Days is available for streaming at TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher.com, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye!